The ayes to the right, 272. The noes to the left, 285.
Voting against a military response in Syria, Britain's parliament rejects intervention over a suspected poisonous gas attack. But where does it leave relations with the US? And will Washington be prepared to go it alone? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. British politicians have voted against military involvement in Syria. It's an embarrassing defeat for Prime Minister David Cameron, who had recalled Parliament to seek consent for missile strikes. Was expecting to stand shoulder to shoulder with US ally Barack Obama. Cameron conceded the vote, reflecting the views of the British people, and would act accordingly. Opposition leader Ed Miliband said MPs had reacted against the Prime Minister's cavalier and reckless leadership.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, there having been no motion passed by this House tonight, can the Prime Minister confirm to the House that he will not use the royal prerogative to order the UK to be part of military action, given the will of the House that has been expressed tonight, before there's been another vote in this House of Commons?
Order. It is, of course, not a matter for the Chair, but the Prime Minister has heard it and is welcome to respond.
Point of order, and I can give that assurance. Let me say the House has not voted for either motion tonight. I strongly believe in the need for a tough response to the use of chemical weapons, but I also believe in respecting the will of this House of Commons. It is very clear tonight that while the House has not passed a motion, it is clear to me that the British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly.
The vote is now raising questions about Britain's international standing. Britain's Chancellor George Osborne says Britain will now have to do some soul-searching about its role in the world. The chairman of Parliament's Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Richard Ottaway, said after the vote that Britain stands a lot shorter tonight. And the former Lib Dem leader, Lord Ashdown, said he'd never been so depressed and ashamed of his country for failing to step into the Syrian conflict. The decision is also likely to bruise the so-called special relationship Britain has enjoyed with the US. The White House says America will now act in its own best interests in dealing with the crisis in Syria.
The British have been very strong in condemning the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons. And that vote in the Parliament doesn't change that. And that's a very significant position for any nation to take publicly. We'll continue to work with Britain and consult with Britain as we are with all our allies.
To our panel in a moment after reaction from our correspondents in Washington and London.
David Cameron has been humiliated in the British Parliament, and there's no doubt that he underestimated the depth of feeling against military intervention in Syria, even within the ranks of his own Conservative Party and perhaps within the wider British public. The result is that he is a diminished figure, domestically, politically, but also on the international stage. It puts the Americans in an awkward situation. They're being very polite about the British in public, but in private this must have been a nasty surprise. Of course, militarily, the Americans have the means, more than the means, to go it alone against Syria, but they were relying on British support for political and diplomatic reasons, and that support is no longer there.
The Obama administration says the President Barack Obama is prepared to go it alone in Syria, but this makes his job much tougher when it comes to the American public. He told them he would build an international coalition. He's going to have to try to explain how he's done that despite not having the support of either the British, the Germans, or the Canadians. It also makes his job tougher in this way. Already, about 200 members of Congress have sent letters here to the White House saying that the president has to get their approval before he does anything involving the military in Syria. Now members are starting to say if Parliament got a vote, so should the U.S. Congress. And it appears the American people believe that as well. In a new poll, 80% say that the president should ask for the authority from Congress. It'd be a tough vote, though. About 50% of the American people say they don't want to get involved in Syria, even if chemical weapons were used.
Let's bring in our guests. In London, British Conservative MP Andrew Rosendale. From Washington, D.C., Graham Bannerman, former Middle East analyst with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the U.S. State Department. And joining us via Skype from London is Ian Black, Middle East editor for The Guardian newspaper. Andrew Rosendale, let me start off with you. What a dramatic day in Parliament. I gather it didn't go the way you wanted it to. How do you feel about that?
Well, first of all, I think that the British people are rather fatigued by so many wars that we get involved with in the Middle East. And it's not surprising that most MPs were not willing to vote for it at this stage. Yes, the Prime Minister was right to bring it to Parliament. He was right to highlight the atrocities that are going on in Syria. But is it right that we should act so quickly and simply because the US President wants to do so now? I think the British want to consider long-term the implications of our involvement in yet another Middle Eastern country which is in crisis.
Can you give us a sense of some of the pressures that all sides were under in Parliament?
Well, of course, it's a hugely important decision to make. It's not a decision that any Member of Parliament can take lightly. We've had the experience of Iraq and Afghanistan, and particularly over Iraq, there is that shadow of what took place 10 years ago and how people felt that they were misled over that issue. And so I don't think Britain is going to jump when asked to do so by an American president again that easily. And I think that David Cameron, whilst being totally honourable in what he tried to achieve, and I have to say that I think he performed brilliantly, and I also believe that the way he explained the issue convinced a lot of people. It convinced me not to vote against the government. I abstained in the end. But at the end of the day, we have to think about whether the British involvement in Syria is actually the right thing to do at this stage. And I think most people feel that it's not.
In Black, do you agree with that Cameron played this brilliantly, or do you think he had a bit of a hand in losing the vote?
No, I think that Cameron miscalculated. I think he misjudged the mood of Parliament, of his own party, of the Labour opposition, and indeed the mood of the country. Of course, he has to put a brave face on it, and he had no choice but to accept the will of Parliament. Anything else would have been completely scandalous. But I think that this was a serious defeat for this government, and one which has quite rightly caused a lot of head-scratching and soul-searching about Britain's role in the world, particularly along with its long-standing ally, the United States. And the background to all this goes back, most people still remember, to the war in Iraq 10 years ago, and the shadow of that was looming very large across the House of Commons when this issue was being discussed last night.
In the light of that, do you agree with Ed Miliband's comments that he was indeed cavalier and reckless?
There's a curious intersection here between a major, continuing, unresolved and very grave international crisis and the rough and tumble of domestic politics. The larger question is, I think, as Andrew Rosendale referred to, is the sense of a British public which does not have the appetite for these sort of interventions in the Middle East in the light of the experience of recent years. Where I think there is perhaps more substantial criticism, where it's appropriate, is that the case that the British government made, particularly in the intelligence dossier that it released yesterday, was really very thin. And you would have to conclude that if they really wanted it to happen, then they perhaps should have tried harder to convince people. I'm not sure that that would have been impossible. But the fact is that they didn't. The case wasn't made. And that, I think, is a failure of the Prime Minister, leaving aside the predictable sniping, of course, from the leader of the Labour opposition.
Okay, Graham Bannerman, I'm sure the response and what happened in Parliament is still filtering in across the pond there. What is your reaction, the US response to this, other than surprise, possibly?
Well, I think surprise was there, and I think disappointment, but I want to make clear that I don't think it affects at all the long-term U.S.-British relationship. We understand how democracies work, but it does create more difficulties for the president, both internationally and domestically. Internationally, he's committed to building a coalition, and one of the key, and if not the most key partner, has said we're not going to be participating, so that's much more difficult for the president. Secondly, at home, we face the same sort of challenge that the British Prime Minister did, in that the majority of Americans are not in favor of military action in Syria, and the president has to make the case, and he has a Congress that's asserting its authority under the Constitution that wants to be consulted. So it has made his life more difficult, but I don't think it has changed the fundamental course of the American president.
Ian Black touched on an important point there, that some of the evidence that has been presented clearly wasn't enough to convince those in the UK Parliament. What's the feeling over where you are? Is much more needed before a strike is sanctioned?
So far, the administration has been able to convince most of the congressional leaders that they have enough evidence to satisfy that the Syrian government did use chemical weapons. However, in the general public, the debate is becoming a little more noisy over the last several days as people say, wait a second, we don't think that's quite enough, we need a little more definite answers here. And so the longer it goes on, the more difficult it is for the president.
Andrew Rosendale, what were you told? What convinced you that going in was the right action?
Well, I wasn't convinced, and that's why I abstained on the vote. I voted against the motion put forward by Miliband, the amendment, but I abstained on the main government motion. I wasn't convinced. I think there are times when Britain has taken action and done so proudly to defend innocent people and the freedom of countries and to defend the national interest, but this is not one of them. We aren't yet in a position where I think it's sensible for British forces to be committed to such a thing. And I think that we are looking at a civil war in Syria. We're looking at a situation that I'm not sure British or American involvement at this stage is going to make matters better. So I think we should be cautious and we shouldn't be rushing in to military action, which is why I wouldn't vote with the government yesterday evening, despite the persuasive efforts of the Prime Minister.
Graham says that this is unlikely to damage the so-called special relationship that you have with the US. Do you agree with that, or do you think that Britain is still more excited about this relationship than possibly the US is?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I think that people in the United Kingdom are very fond of America, and we've always stood shoulder to shoulder with America. But in recent years, I think that has worn off slightly, and I regret that. It doesn't help when the United States of America fail to support Britain over issues like the Falkland Islands, where they are not backing the freedom and the rights of the people in those islands. So it seems like America sometimes picks and chooses when it wants to be Britain's best friend. And I think that it's issues like that are starting to annoy the British people, that America seems to be a fair weather friend at times. And I'm speaking as someone who's always been a very strong supporter of the United States, and very much appreciated the special relationship, particularly with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. It's a great pity that American presidents in recent years, particularly the current one, doesn't want to support Britain over an issue that's important to us, yet expects British forces to fight with the Americans when it's an issue that they think is important. So I think America needs to do a lot more work on the special relationship if they want to restore the trust between our two countries.
Ian, is this somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory in the sense that some people are saying that this is going to isolate Britain even further?
Well, you know, I think that the sort of comments we're hearing in London today is about, you know, a period of reflection and have to think about these things. But I don't think that Britain is going to, you know, kind of pack up and shuffle off the world stage. It remains, after all, let's not forget, it remains, anomalous though it may be, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear weapons state. It has its place at the top table But this has been a salutary reminder that democratic governments have to take public opinion into account, parliamentary views into account, when they consider significant actions. And, that's not a bad thing. What's sad, I think, in all this, and reflections about Britain and its place in the world and the state of the much vaunted special relationship with Washington, is that all this has got very little to do with the, if you like, the main actor in this story, which is poor old Syria and its unending suffering. And none of this, it seems to me, is going to do anything to bring a resolution of Syria's agony any closer. I mean, it's a little bit of sort of navel gazing, I think, in Britain about this. Obviously, we all like a good parliamentary drama and so on, and the sparring that goes with it. But at the end of the day, this is about the real subject is about a country which is dying as the rest of the world really wrings its hand and dithers and doesn't know what to do. I think there's a risk of losing sight of that in the midst of the domestic political drama and the transatlantic link under strain.
Okay, well, let's find out if the biggest player at this stage, Graham, is going to do anything about it. You say that this action is leaving Barack Obama and the US slightly exposed. It seems that he's still going to go ahead, though. What sort of support can he now look for, and where will he look?
Well, he clearly has the support of the French and the Turks in this, and he has some domestic support here that's quite strong, that it feels that the United States need to act on the same arguments that they were made in Britain. Our world credibility is involved, but we also face the same problems that the debate did in England. What will this do to Syria to make it better? That has not been made clear. Furthermore, what happens next? And finally, as former Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said, the President hasn't made the case to the American people that the national security interests of the United States are involved in this action.
Do you think Britain's stance now will affect the perceived legitimacy of the strike that we're expecting any day soon?
I think the American people who favor this, including most of the people in the administration, is that chemical weapon usage by the Syrian government is unacceptable, and we need to stand up against that principle in international law. And therefore, the necessity to act is actually imperative for the United States against the use of chemical weapons. Because if you don't stand, what happens to the next time, and the next time, and the next time?
I'm going to bring in Facebook now, because there have been some interesting comments that I'd like to put to our guests. Ted Folk says, "Thank God for British parliamentarians with a conscience. Cameron is finished politically." And Syed Irfan Mehdi adds, "It shows that British people do not want to be fooled again, as it was with Iraq and the so-called chemical weapons story." Mohammed Samsul Siddiqui says, "Let the US start, then Britain will join eventually. Whatever is needed, Assad must be brought down and hit hard so he can't continue killing his own people." But Joseph De Philippe writes, "The Europeans need to deal with this, not the US." Andrew, I want to pick up that point by Mohammed. He says that let the US start this and the Britain might join eventually. Is there any chance that that is likely to happen?
Well, I think it is likely that America will take action itself, maybe supported by one or two other countries. It is possible that Britain at some stage would want to be involved in this. It's not ruled out. The Prime Minister made it clear that if there were to be action, there'd be another vote in any case. So last night's vote actually made no difference, in the sense that we could still have gone in and taken part as and when the time came, and as and when Parliament agreed to it. So I think that at the end of the day we have to look at the facts of this. The facts are that we are looking at a civil war in Syria. The West, so easy for us to jump in with both feet and get our fingers burnt, and I don't think we should do that. And that's why the British people and Parliament last night are very cautious about going into this. I think that the situation in Syria is appalling, and we should use every possible means to try to resolve it. I think we should be speaking to Russia. They have far more influence on Assad than we do, and yet the Russians and the Americans and the British are not sitting down together to try and resolve this. I think we should put a lot more of effort into that before we take military action.
Sure, and I should imagine a lot depends on what Assad's response is to this strike. He has said that he will strike out, and he will strike out hard if anyone interferes.
Well, we don't know what Assad's reaction will be. My concern is not about Assad, but about the opposition as well. I'm not sure if the opposition are necessarily better than Assad. We know that Al-Qaeda have strong elements within the opposition. It's a very messy situation, and we've got to be very careful that we don't intervene and make matters worse.
Graham, shouldn't these superpowers be using their powers to rather achieve a ceasefire and a negotiated political settlement than pondering about how to go in and attack Syria?
Well, I think from the American administration position, they have tried for a long time to do some political solution to the situation in Syria and has not made much headway. The problem is it's the use of chemical weapons by the Assad government. The president was absolutely explicit last year that that would be a red line in which he needed to act. He sort of put himself into a corner by making this statement, because now he is either going to say, I didn't really mean it was a red line, I'm not going to act, or I'm going to act because chemical weapons were used. And that's his dilemma right now.
Ian Black, do you think anything that we're seeing at the moment, the politics underway, do you think any of it is sending the strong message to Assad or who's ever behind using chemical weapons in Syria that it is unacceptable and it will be stopped?
No, I don't think there is such a message, and I think that is, part of this tangled tale that we need to be focusing on. I mean, the fact is that certainly in Britain, clearly, public and parliamentary opinion has not been convinced of the case against Assad. But there is a lot of evidence, and I think it's possible to reach a reasonable judgment about the likely culprit in the attack in Damascus. There isn't a clear message. I think that the message to Assad is that certainly there is strong suspicions, at the very least, that he used weapons which are banned, about which there is a taboo, and the international response is not sending a clear message that that's unacceptable. And the British government and others say that even before the most recent incident, there were 12 or 14 cases of the use of chemical weapons. Now, that hasn't been proven unequivocally, but I don't think it's likely to have been invented either. So the response, the division, the disarray over this is clearly not going to buttress the message that these weapons should not be used, must not and cannot be used.
Graham, how important do you think it is now to bring in the Arab League and to use them as a bigger player in all of this right now?
Well, clearly the administration would like to see the Arab League come in and endorse some sort of military action against the Syrian government. But I think that's going to be more problematic now than it certainly was in the case of Libya. And I think that's one of the problems the administration faces, is they don't have the allies in the region, they don't have the large coalition around the world, and they've more and more looking isolated, or not isolated, but not having a large coalition with them. And that's creating a domestic problem for them and an international problem for them.
And of course, Andrew, in the meantime, what the world needs to hear is what the clear objectives are, and to try and explain how you can enter a conflict that's very hard to win.
Well, I don't think we can win it. I think the lesson from previous conflicts such as this is that there aren't winners. You'll finish up getting mired in something which is very hard to get out of. And I think one of the concerns that I have, and one of the concerns I think most people in Britain have, is that yet again it's America, it's Britain, it's the English-speaking countries that have to take the lead on these things, and that's why the British people are not happy about it, and that's why the MPs won't vote for it, because yet again it's the English-speaking world having to act as the world's policeman. Often the Australians are part of that too, the Canadians. We're rather fed up with this. Why won't the Arab countries take some responsibility? Many of the Arab countries have military weaponry which can be used, but they don't seem to want to do so. It's all very well for the Arab League to say, yes, we want America to act. Why don't some of those countries take the lead in an Arabic country? Surely that would be more appropriate. And I think that if they did that, we would certainly support such an action. But to expect the English-speaking world all the time to take the lead on these things is becoming rather tiresome, and that's why people are not supporting the action at the moment.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for talking about these rather dramatic events that we saw in the British Parliament. Andrew Rosendale, Graham Bannerman and Ian Black. Don't forget, you can find this programme, many more at aljazeera.com. You can leave us your comments there too. I'm Jane Dutton. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.